Dear colleagues, welcome at the National Bank of Ukraine at our traditional open research seminar. And today we are very proud to host our colleague from Banque de France, Klodiana Istrefi, who will talk a little bit about the investigation on the results of the voting from the Fed's FOMC. Her research is directed to the topic which is very important for Ukraine. Probably you know that we also started to publish the votes of our monetary policy committee last year, and it will be very interesting, of course, to look at the procedure of the experience of more advanced central bank and the research done on this topic. So please, Klodiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning and hello from me. I'm Klodiana Istrefi. I come from Banque de France. I'm not French, I'm Albanian. I've been working there since 5 years now. I'm a research economist. And this research study is about FOMC, which is the Federal Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve. It's the committee that decides on monetary policy in the US. And I'm talking about the Federal Reserve, so about other central bankers, but I'm from Banque de France, and these are only my views, and they do not represent the views of Banque de France or the Euro system. This is a joint work with Майклом Bordo. He's a professor he's a historian, a monetary policy historian at Rutgers University. So let me start. What is the context? So the context is that nowadays in modern central banks, monetary policy is decided by committees, not by one person, but a group of persons, like is the case at the National Bank of Ukraine. And there are good reasons why there's a group and not one. The simple idea is that two heads think better than one head. So groups are known to pool knowledge and have a diversity of views represented when the decision is taken. They also can caution against extreme preferences of one person. So if, let's say, you have a crazy governor, you would have other members probably with more reasonable views that will not let these extreme views dominate. And also it has been shown in experiments that groups take superior decisions than individuals. Now, this is the context. The idea is that these committees evolve. We don't have always the same people. So times pass by, new people come in, people go out. So the personalities in these committees change. So if we look over time, the preferences of these people change, and the majorities change. So some preferences will be grouped together, so there will be shifts over time. And the question is that what forms preferences, policy preferences of these members? And the second, does it matter, the policy preferences for monetary policy? From theory, we have the belief that preferences are exogenous. They have fallen from the sky. So we are born with certain beliefs and they will be like that. So we don't know what forms preferences. They are exogenous. However, we know that they matter. So if we know the literature on monetary policy shocks, we usually say that one of the sources of monetary policy shock is an exogenous change in the preferences of a policymaker. So I usually use this example. Imagine Mario Draghi going to sleep as an Italian and waking up as a German. So this would be exogenous shock in the preference of the central banker, because we have a belief that Italians are more dovish, more supportive of growth, and Germans are more scared of inflation, so they would more be fearing. So this would be the idea of a preference and how a change in preference would change policy. And so this is theory. When we look at empirics, like data, it's difficult because the preference of policymaker we don't observe. So we don't know what is in the mind of people. However, we observe that these committee members, they vote differently. Some want higher interest rates, some are lower interest rates, so they dissent for different reasons. They prefer different rates, and they speak differently. So either in the tone of their speech, or so they speak differently. So there is diversity in these members. So what is the question in my research? One, what forms policy preferences? And I'm going to take the example of the Federal Reserve. And with these questions, we're going to make two contributions. One, we have a measure that characterizes the policy type, the type of the policymaker. And this is a measure that I have created. It's a novel index, and I'm calling that hawks and doves. So it's birds, but usually these terms are used to categorize policymakers, where hawks are those people who are more ready to fight inflation, and doves, those that want to support growth and employment. And this is particular for the US because the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. So usually central banks have one mandate, price stability. Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, which is price stability and maximum employment. This leaves room for these members to lean more towards one or the other objective. So I have created this measure of hawks and doves. I've started from the 60s, and there have been 130 members since the 60s, and I've categorized them in hawks, doves, and another type, which I call swingers. So when I look over time, I have two types, hawk and dove. However, when I look from the whole time that these people stayed in the board, let's say, I observed that some are perceived to change type. At the beginning as hawks and sometimes as doves. So these are swingers, those who switch camps. And we'll talk about who are swingers and why they swing. So I have three types, all-time hawks. So for the whole time that they stayed in the FOMC, they are perceived as more ready to fight inflation, all-time doves and swingers. Then the other contribution is that when we ask what forms a hawk, what forms a dove, and what forms a swinger, we are going to take to look at the literature that is on psychology and social psychology, which tells that people form their beliefs in early life. All of us form our beliefs in early life, which is by education, and let's say up to 25 and 30 years, and then we are going to stuck with these beliefs, and it's very hard to change our minds later. So at the beginning we are very flexible, we get information, we form our beliefs, and then we get stuck with them. So this is the idea, and with this respect we are going to look at what great events happened when these people were born. For example, were they born during a period of great inflation or a great, let's say, Great Depression, and where they studied. Where they studied, we're going to look with respect to members that did their PhD, so have a doctorate, they have graduate studies, and in the US, it matters where if you studied in a Chicago type of school, or if you studied at Yale or Berkeley or Harvard. And we're going to call them freshwater versus saltwater schools of thought. Freshwater are the universities linked to the Chicago type of school because they are around the lakes, so it's freshwater, and saltwater universities that are around the coast, so the water is salty. So this is the distinction. And then we're going to ask, do these preferences or this composition in terms of hawks and doves matters for monetary policy? And here we are going to take a typical Taylor rule, forward-looking, with data as it is known in real time, which are the Green Book forecasts. This is a forecast prepared by the research staff of the Federal Reserve. I'm going to put there the hawk and dove composition and see if this explains something. To preview the results, well, in terms of what forms hawks, doves, and swingers, of course we don't have clear-cut answers, but we have some tendencies. A hawk, the odds of being a hawk are highest if they are born during a period of high inflation. And a period of high inflation, it's not only the great inflation, but the two world wars have had higher inflation than the great inflation of the 70s. They graduated from a freshwater university, the Chicago type of school, and these people are appointed in their position. So a hawk is mostly appointed by a Republican president, idea that Republicans are more conservative, so they would prefer more conservative people, and or the regional Fed that is known to have some institutional ideology or memory. A dove is most probably born during a high unemployment period, like the Great Depression, graduated from a saltwater university, and it was appointed by a Democratic president, so more liberal, so it was a liberal appointment. Swingers, they are close to doves. They're mostly non-economists, so you don't have only economists in the FOMC. Some are lawyers, or that they have an MBA, or in the 60s they had bachelor, or they had coming with army or chemistry degree. And they graduated mostly from what we call other universities, not freshwater, not saltwater, but from other universities, and stayed longer in the FOMC. The idea is that shifting or changing type takes time. So they stayed longer, so there was more time for the public to observe that there was a switch. When looking if this matters for monetary policy, so using this Taylor rule type of technique, we see that actually the hawk-dove composition helps explain deviation of federal funds rates from a standard forward looking Taylor rule, and I will give you especially some dates where it matters the composition, and this will be dates where the FOMC is rotating the voting rights. The FOMC changes the voting rights every year. 4 regional Fed presidents get the voting rights, 4 get out, and there are times where this composition changes just because of this rotation, and this will matter for monetary policy. And because it matters who is sitting there, maybe this is an explanation of why the choice of who is going to decide on monetary policy is very important. Maybe especially with Trump as president, you might read more and more news about his nominations. Many of his nominations have been, let's say, not approved. He has the rare chance of putting 6 people in the board. So far he has put 4 of them, including the Fed chair, Powell. However, most of his names, some other names have not been approved because they have to be approved by the Senate. And most of his nomination has been very controversial. And maybe this is the idea that if I'm putting somebody there, he or she would be ideological and support policies preferred by president. So maybe this is a reason why this confirmation is so controversial. So let me just tell how it relates with the literature. We relate to several strands of literature. One is central bankers' preferences and what determines them. There are many papers in this category. Second is this literature that comes more from the social psychology, the idea that life experience affects economic decisions. And third, the use of narrative and textual analysis to learn more about monetary policy and to use, let's say, measures that we get from narratives and learn something more about monetary policy. So we have the Romer and Romer with famous monetary policy shocks that is just by narratives, reading text and other. I'm not going into detail for reason of time, but I'm going to tell that how we have learned about preferences so far in the literature. So as I said, the true preferences we don't know, we don't observe. So we have to use proxies. And what has been used so far as a proxy is dissents, how these members, when it is the moment of, so there is an alternative, and they're around the table, and I have to say, I agree, I disagree. And the disagreement is called a dissent, and they sometimes have to say why they're disagreeing. They would like a higher interest rate or they would like a lower interest rate. And for those people that dissent, that want higher interest rate or lower than what is the majority wanting, the research has used them as a source of information about saying, okay, these people have different preferences, which is good. The problem is that, especially for FOMC, but other types of committees, that dissents are very rare. If you look at the FOMC from the 60s that I'm studying, only 7% of votes have been dissent. And 40% of members, they never dissented. And from those that dissented, they dissented on both sides, sometimes for higher rates and sometimes for lower rates. So you cannot really tell the type just from this very limited information. There are some other researchers who have read the transcripts, and now you have the chance to go back in the 60s and read everything that has been said during the meeting. And from that information, you could create a series when they are going around and having this discussion about interest rate. They're saying, the alternative is 7%, but I would like a notch higher, or I would like a notch down. Or they would say, I agree with the person that spoke before me that I would like a 7.5. So a researcher has gone through all these documents and has put a preferred interest rate. So this is a limited sample, but this can be done. So if you have time to read all these transcripts, and these preferred rates tell you that some members prefer another type, so higher rates than the one that was chosen, and some lower than the one that was chosen. This is as well an indication of the preferences. But there is one problem. There's not much variation on these preferred rates at the end. And second, before these materials were not available to the public. Until the 90s, the members themselves didn't know that they are recorded. So there was this information, but there was very private information. In the 90s, the Fed was kind of forced to publish this information, and now we can read this transcript, but with 5 years. We have to wait 5 years to read what they have been saying. So we cannot have in real time this information. The other thing is that in the literature, when discussing this, why these preferences or why these people are dissenting this way or that way, is that there is no formal discussion or where is the source of this heterogeneity. Usually there have been just a comparison. Dissenters for tight, dissenters for loose, if they are economists, if they are non-economists, if they are board members, if they are Federal Reserve presidents, this type of comparison. But you don't know really the source. Where comes the source? And there is one exception, which is Майклом Д et al. It's a paper that is very close to our paper. And they are highlighting lifetime inflation experience as a source of why these people might vote differently. And their idea is that for members that have gone through high periods of inflation, maybe they will forecast a higher inflation when they or they would like tighter monetary policies. But they're looking at all lifetime. So I'm a board member, I'm going to forecast inflation. If, let's say in my 30 years of life or 40 years of life, I had experienced high inflation, that will be part of my information set. What we are stressing, first, we have this Taylor-used measure of policy preference, hawks and doves, which really speaks about each member. And we are highlighting forming factors in early stage. We are saying what forms these preferences really what happened in the first 20, 25 years of their life. And we are taking this. So let me show now how, if you have any question, please do interrupt me. So how do I construct this measure of hawks and doves? So the hawk and dove is a term that relates with the leanings of these members with respect to the dual mandate of the Fed. And this measure is based on US newspapers. So what I do is I go for each member, I go to US newspaper, I look for the name of one member, and I want to see whatever has been said about policy preferences of this member. So I want to find quotes that tell me something if he's a hawk, a dove, a conservative, or a liberal. And To do that, I had to read more than 20,000 articles. This is made by reading, human readings. It's not made by computer and algorithm, what is now done. I don't know yet how to do that, because it's a little bit more difficult. It's not just counting of words or finding keywords. It's really about reading, understanding a sentence. I can give you an example. And I've used a lot of newspapers, and to do that, you need to have these news archives. How do newspapers or those who write their monetary analysts form the perceptions about this member? They will look at everything. It will be like a FBI investigations whenever these people come to the FOMC. They will look at their backgrounds, political interest, who is supporting them. So if it's a board member that has been nominated by a Republican president and is supported in the Senate by Republicans, they say, probably it's a conservative. Or if it is coming from, it's getting a support from liberals, they will say, probably this has liberal preferences. Then most of these members have expressed their economic views either before coming at the FOMC or during by their speeches, testimonies, writings, and then they will come at the FOMC, they will vote. Some will probably dissent. If this dissent will become public, this will as well will feed their information on the type. How do I learn about the perceptions? So when I read these newspapers, sometimes it's easy. They are expressed directly. They will say, he or she is a conservative, liberal, easy or tight money guy, inflation hawk or inflation dove. And these terms have changed over time. So from the 60s to today, there have been a variation on these terms. Then they don't have to always tell it's a hawk or it's a dove. Sometimes they just they tell about their positions with respect to inflation, economic growth, or this. For example, they would say, 1966, William Chesney Martin, he was the Fed chair for almost 20 years. Inflation is his concern. So this will give me an indication that in 1966, I know because I'm reading about other members as well in 1966, and not all of them has this concern. So it's his concern, and this will tell that he's a hawkish type. Or in 1968, his critics complain that he's far too worried about inflation, not concerned enough with full employment and economic growth. So this as well, it's a perception that he's hawk. I will call him hawk and not a dove. So I will have this type of quotes for all the members, 130 members, and I will follow them in real time. So how they are perceived in 66, in 68, and so on. For those that are not very familiar with the FOMC, just a short wrap up. What is the FOMC, the structure? So it makes up 12 members. 7 are the Board of Governors, and these 5 are Reserve Bank presidents. 5 out of 12. There are 12 reserve banks in the federal system. New York Fed president is a permanent voter, so he's voting always with the 7 people, and the 4 other presidents are changing their voting rights. So every year there is a new composition with new 4 reserve presidents taking the voting rights. The process, this rotation scheme is decided by law. It's decided by law. We know that Chicago, and I don't know which one here you have. There are 2, Chicago and Cleveland, I think. They take position each year, and the other ones they take once in 3 years. So, and this scheme is decided by law. Governors are appointed by are nominated by the U.S. president, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate. While the regional Fed presidents, they are appointed by the board of the Reserve Bank. So that's why sometimes they are considered more independent because they are not put there by politics. And because of these changes, the FOMC composition is changing all the time, because there is annual rotation and turnover of members, especially board members are coming and going very fast. So I know who has been sitting at each FOMC, at each meeting, and now I have a perception about each member, and I'm going to aggregate them, how many hawks and doves I have in a particular meeting. And in this, I will explain you this graph. At the moment, I'm giving to each member the same weight. Officially, each member has the same weight, it's one vote. But you might think that maybe, depending on who's the chair, the governor, some governors are more autocratic and let's say it matters, maybe the chair should get 80% and the others very few, or sometimes, like the case of Martin, he was very consensual. So he was not really dominating he wanted to hear the opinion of everybody. If he saw that there is no consensus, he would postpone the meeting, hoping that consensus would form. But here I'm getting the same weight. When I'm going to talk about Taylor rules, I'm going to have two cases, once with the same weight and once where the Fed chair gets 80%, and see if that changes. So in blue, I have, in the light blue, I have the share of doves for each meeting, and in red, the share of hawks. And this line like this, it's the balance, hawks minus doves. You can see that there is a lot of variation. So there are times with hawkish majorities, dovish majorities, hawkish here, and so on. Then the dark part is how much of those hawks in the 60s, let's say in the 60s, were all-time hawks. So you can see that there are periods like in the 70s, here we thought we have, let's say, 60% or a bit more hawks, but only half of them were all-time hawks. Some of them were swingers, which I call. There were some doves of the 60s that became hawks in the 70s because inflation became a problem. So this is what are my swingers. And they are 24% of the sample. So I don't have time to talk about what happened here. If you have questions, you can ask me later. And so I have a solo paper that describes all this process and what happened. I have a story about each of these changes. So to wrap up, so I have this measure of hawks and doves. At the individual level, it is assigned to 93% of members. The other members remain unknown. So there was no information about them, there was no mentioning, or even if they were mentioned, there was no information that gives me something about the policy preference. And so we have the three types, all-time hawks, all-time doves, and swingers. When I put them together in the FOMC level, you saw that there are hawkish and dovish majorities. And if I look at board versus Fed presidents, board has perceived to change very often from dovish to hawkish, while regional Fed presidents have been perceived most on the hawkish side. So these were perceptions. So what I call, these are perceptions. So how we perceive them from outside. Then I have done I have asked myself the question, so do this perception match true? We don't know the true, but some true tendencies. And I have seen that these perceptions match quite well how they have voted. So I have a perception in a particular meeting, and then I match with how I'm going to vote in that meeting. And I see that I have a good. Hawks are going to dissent for tighter policies, and Dove are going to dissent for easier policies. I match them with these preferred rates. I explain how one can do the preferred rates, and I also look at their forecasts. They also, FOMC members have to give twice a year forecast to the Congress. And I look at if there is a difference on the forecast of inflation, for example, of hawks versus a dove. And there is this idea that hawks see inflation behind the corner. And I do find that hawks, they will give a higher forecast. Even if the forecast is made with their optimal interest rates, like preferred interest rates. So with their best policy rate, they still have a higher inflation forecast. Now, let's go to the main question of this study. What molds this preference, be a hawk or a dove? And I said we're going to get insights from political science and social psychology that core economic beliefs are formed really on our early life. And it's difficult to change them later in life. So, and these beliefs could relate to family, education, and the economic environment. And this really tells about the role of time, place, and linked or interlinked lives in forming of our beliefs. For example, when they are born during Great Depression, but it's how parents really live this period that is going to affect your beliefs and what your parents. Our parents always like to tell us the stories when you were born, and so this stick with our forever with us. And we're going to focus on this ideology of education, so this divide of schools, if they studied in a Chicago type of school, or Harvard, Berkeley, or Yale, and what great events happened when they were born. And we're going to look as well at ideology by appointment, because at the end, these people are appointed to their positions. We're looking at ideology by education. We're going to divide these members in PhD versus non-PhD. And you can see here that we have freshwater, saltwater, and others. So these are freshwater graduates, and the majority of freshwater graduates are perceived to be hawks later. So you see the majority, the red is for hawk, blue is for doves. Saltwater, there is a mix, so there is a bit of everything, but there is, you can see that doves and swingers are in majority, and you don't see this for the non-PhD student. Non-PhD student, the majority is on the hawkish side. Here you see that from freshwater, majority is hawkish, and from saltwater, there is still a mix, but the divide is more strong for the PhD. So it's really, by going to these schools, they're doing a PhD, they're getting some assumptions of how economy works that will stick with them. So these were the findings. Freshwater PhDs mostly hawks, saltwater dovish and swinger bias, and this is not as striking for the non-PhDs. And then this was on the individual level. Now I'm going to take the education and look at the FOMC level, so on the hawks and dove composition. And these graphs show you the number of members in the FOMC that graduated from a saltwater university in blue and graduated from a freshwater university in red. You can see that the number of PhDs is growing over time. So there's more PhD graduate members in the FOMC. And saltwater have been in majority because most of them come from Harvard as well. And if I put this in a regression where I have the hawk and dove composition, and I'm going to control for the state of the economy based on this Green Book forecast. I have Green Book forecast for inflation expectation, for inflation, and for the growth, GDP growth. And I'm going to put the number of freshwater and saltwater, and you see, adding more freshwater PhDs is going to increase the hawk-dove composition. And adding more saltwater PhD is going to decrease the hawk-dove composition, and these are significant. However, you can see even counting for the state of the economy, they are not explaining a lot. So there are other factors that explain this hawk and dove composition. Now, when we look at life experience at early age, we are going to take as big events. Great Depression will be like the main big event, and we're looking if they are born during Great Depression or before or after. And you can see that those that were born before Great Depression, the majority of them was perceived as hawks. Then, during the Great Depression, the share of hawks and doves and swingers increased. And after then, there is more and more balance. We looked as well at impressionable years, which are the years 18 to 25. This is as well like a year where you're supposed to get to be more like a sponge and get whatever it's out there. And we looked at World War I, Great Depression, World War II, and Great Inflation. Here we don't see a particular pattern. We would just see that hawks have been decreasing and doves have been increasing. And especially this comes after the Great Depression. And what we observed is really that the highest inflation that was in this period, if you look from World War I to the Great Inflation, it's really the World War I. Inflation was up to 24%. And on the period which we call Great Inflation, is really Great Inflation, post-war inflation. Maximum was 14%, 10-14%. So the World War really had very high inflation. We do the same thing looking at the FOMC level. So this is the number of members that were born before Great Depression in the FOMC, and then of course they will go away, and then the highest share comes from those that are born after Great Depression. So here we don't really have, I do anyway this type of regression just to see that if you were born before a Great Depression, the number, the positive sign on the hawk and dove, so it will increase the hawkishness of the FOMC. And if you are born during a Great Depression, it will increase the dovishness of the FOMC. And this will be significant. Ideology by appointment, and as I said, these people are appointed. The Board of Governors are appointed by the President, US President, and the regional Fed presidents by the regional Fed board. So when we match, we look at, so Republican nominations, most of them, so you have a more balanced here. First I will talk what is more striking, kind of expected, that Democratic president nominations are perceived as doves. Normally you would expect Republican nominations to proceed mostly as hawks or conservative, and we see that it's higher than from Democrat nominations, but Republicans at the end as well, they want to win elections. So they don't want only strong hawks. And the other thing is that the president is choosing, let's say, is nominating the member, but the Senate has to confirm the member. And normally you have to choose a member that you think is going to win the votes of the Senate. And most of these nominations under Republican president has been confirmed under a Senate with Democratic majority. So that's why their nominations had to look good to Democrats as well. And you don't see this for regional Fed presidents. They are not politically related, so they have been perceived hawks independent on who was president at the time that they were chosen. And with regional Fed presidents, we have to look at the regional Fed. So is there something about Cleveland Fed or that is different from New York Fed or Boston Fed? And it is. There are some regional Feds who are known to have a kind of ideology. The St. Louis Fed is known to be the monetarist type of people, Cleveland Fed to be outspoken with inflation-fighting roots. And you see that if you were a regional Fed president from Cleveland, mostly perceived as hawks. If you're from San Francisco, it's doves and swingers. Or if you're Boston, so you see doves and swingers more than hawks. What about swingers? So these are members that are perceived to change type over time. And what we find is that higher odds of them being non-economists, they are either lawyers or other type of education, and these and studied in other universities. So imagine there is a lawyer in the board and they don't have strong assumptions of how economy should work or what is the role of institutions, and they will see which is let's say the view that would convince them, or which is the most pressing problem. So they will go with who convinces them and what is the most pressing problem. That's why you see more swings in this type of category. Then, as I said, they stayed longer in the Fed, in the FOMC, and there are some events that made them swing. So a big swing from doves to hawks happened in the 70s, where inflation became a problem. So there was a hawkish swing. And here there is as well a swing, first for hawkish and then for dovish. So what happened in the 90s, mid-90s? There's not a big problem in the US about inflation being high or so. But in the beginning of the 90s, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand announced inflation targeting of 0 to 2%. Bank of Canada followed. And Federal Reserve as well started to discuss about removing inflation from the equation. So a lot of these members were very supportive of starting inflation targeting and putting inflation at 0. So in the public, all members sounded very hawkish. So that's why we have this swing for hawks. Then by mid-90s, the end of 90s, Greenspan came with the idea that there is the productivity is growing fast, and this productivity is not going to lead to inflation. And in that time, at the beginning, it was a bit controversial. Regional Fed presidents wanted to raise rates because they say, okay, there is productivity, economy is heating, so we should hike. And Greenspan was trying to make them, to put them down. And some of the members followed Greenspan. So this is the swing for doves. And Greenspan as well is perceived to be a dove, and thus he's a swinger in this categorization. Now let's look if these preferences in terms of hawks and doves matter for monetary policy. As usual, we're going to take the standard Taylor rule type of technique. We have a Taylor rule with Fed funds rates as a function of green book forecast for inflation, green book forecast for GDP growth, and the output gap. So as I said, green book forecasts are prepared by the research staff of the board, and they are given to the board members before the meeting. So we will take this as the state of economy as expected in real time. This is, we have taken the preferred specification of Kobiona-Gorodnichenko. So at least we start from something that is preferred and kind of well established and say, take the same data, take the same time. We have updated up to 2007, and let's see what happens if we add here the composition of the FOMC in terms of hawks and doves. So we're going to add this variable, and this variable will take different forms. First is the hawk and dove balance with the same weight. So I'm giving the same weight to each voter. Then I'm going to give 80% to the preference of the Fed chair and 20% to the rest. And these are corrected for the state of the economy, these measures. Then, and in the third, I'm going to divide these hawks and doves into majorities, strong majorities. I will say, I will have a dummy variable that is 1 if it is a strong hawkish majority, and another dummy variable that is 1 for strong dovish majorities. And so if it's a strong dovish majority, what is left is either a strong hawk or something in between. How do I define strong majorities? I'm going to do the 75th percentile, 25th percentile, and what is left in the middle is like let's say the uncertain majority. Then I'm going to put in another specification the fresh and saltwater PhD graduates. So I showed you a graph with a number of people in the FOMC that graduated from this university, and if they were born during Great Depression or after. Then in the final, I'm going to use, there's this idea of policy inertia in the monetary policy. I'm going to add a lagged funds rates and persistent shocks. I'm going to follow the example of Kobiona-Gorodnichenko, just see if things change. So we have this big table, and I'm just going to explain. So the first 3 variables, and the column 1 is the standard specification. Taylor rule with inflation forecast, output gap, growth forecast. Is the normal one, there is a principle, the Taylor principle is satisfied, nothing special. So everybody agrees with this. Then I'm going to add one by one my FOMC composition. First is the difference, so first difference of hawks, doves with equal weight. Then I'm going to add the hawk dove, again, difference with 80% weight on the chair. Then another specification with these 2 dummies, dove majority and hawk majorities. Then I'm having the freshwater versus saltwater and where they were born, and the final will add the lagged and the persistent shock. So now I just invite you to see these numbers. Adding the hawk-dove composition, higher if you have more hawks, it will be a positive effect on the federal funds rate, so you would expect that interest rates will be higher. If you give to the chair 80% of the weight, again, you will have a positive effect, which will be much higher than if you give them an equal weight. If you take into account only strong majorities, very strong dove or very strong hawkish majority, you see that in a dove with a strong majority, interest rates will decrease by almost 60 basis points. If we have more freshwater versus saltwater, again, this will have a positive sign, as expected. We said freshwater are mostly perceived as hawks, so they would most probably vote for higher interest rates. And if they were born during Great Depression, they will have a negative effect on the funds rate. So, as we discussed before, we add the lag, the persistent shock, and again, the hawk dove will stay significant. So, what is this telling us? That the composition matters, and here I'm looking at this case of strong hawks and strong dovish majorities. We saw that a move to a dovish majorities reduces the interest rate by 50 basis points, and In this graph, what I'm depicting in red is the areas, the periods with strong hawk majorities, and in blues are the areas with strong dove majorities. The areas that are white are areas where there were majorities were not as strong, right? And in red is the federal funds rate as it happened, so it's the actual Fed funds rate. In blue, in light blue, is the federal funds rate that the Taylor rule with hawks and doves would suggest. And the one with the dotted lines, the dashed line, is what a Taylor rule only with inflation and output gap would suggest. So what we observe is that interest rate hikes, so let's say we are here, interest rate hikes are predicted to be higher and faster if you have under hawkish majorities, and interest rate cuts are suggested to be stronger under the dovish majority. Now here I'm going just to get your attention on these dates, which is 97, 98, 99, when we have a move from a strong hawk to a strong dove. It's almost immediate move from a strong hawk to a strong dove, and it is the time where the Taylor rule with hawks and doves perform best. So it's really how it happened. It is doing better than the standard Taylor rule with only inflation. And I'm going to say what happened in these dates. There is another date where the Taylor rule with hawks and doves is performing better, 2001, 2002. So in 99, Taylor rule with only inflation and output suggests a tight monetary policy. Then it happened. And the Taylor rule with hawks and doves suggests an easier policy. And this is what more in line with what happened. And in the first meeting of 99, there was a strong move from a hawkish majority to a dovish majority. And this came only because of the rotation of the voting rights of regional Fed presidents. By this rotation, which is exogenous and decided, as I said, is decided before who's going to vote, like which federal reserves are going to vote, not which persons. There were 4 hawks in the 98, were substituted by 3 doves and a hawk. And here I give who were the voting rights. So in 98 were Boston Fed, Cleveland, Kansas City, and St. Louis. And the votes went to Philadelphia, Chicago, Dallas, and Minneapolis. And the presidents of the Boston, Cleveland Fed, Kansas City, St. Louis in that time were perceived all as hawks. Now, another thing that this rotation also reduced the number of freshwater graduates. So freshwater graduates in the 98 were 3, and they reduced to 0 in the 99. So there were both the freshwater and the hawks. So it was a composition that made this difference. So you can just see that it's a rotation scheme, which changes the composition, and this has effect for how monetary policy evolved. In 2001, 2002, we have a move to a strong dovish majority. Before we were in a white area, which means there were hawks and doves, but not a strong majority of any of them. But then we moved to a very strong dovish majority due to the rotation scheme, and there were new board appointments as well. And here as well, the Taylor rule shows that the federal fund rate cuts were higher than the state of the economy would have suggested. We also look at votes, at dissents, of how these people dissented. So with the Taylor rule, we kind of see the tendency of them, how they would vote, and now we see how they dissent. Remember that dissents are very rare, so this is limited information, but still we say, okay, let's see how they compare. And we can see that the hawks, here we have dissents in total, dissents for tighter, dissent for easier. So hawks would tend to dissent for tighter policy, and here I have tighter per member because there is, let's say, one member that will do the most of the dissents, like dissenting all the time. So I'm kind of checking for that. And you can see that ideology by education, freshwater, so like 4.2 dissents per member. So they would dissent for tighter policy, while saltwater, it's very tight, 1.9 and 1.3. And as well, if you were born during Great Depression, you are going to mostly dissent for easier policy. So here as well, we have kind of confirmation of the results that hawk and dove balance is important it's important statistically and economically. Just to wrap up, and I'm going to finish here. So policy preferences of these members matter in the interest rate setting. And this is consistent with the popular wisdom, what we kind of think in normal life. And this is why Fed watchers are paying a lot of attention who is there and making these hawk and dove scales. Because the idea is really to kind of predict where policy is going. And these results might explain, as I said in the beginning, why the confirmation of some Fed governors has become very toxic and controversial in the recent years. The idea is that probably Republican senators are critical of candidates who are perceived as doves, and Democratic senators are critical of candidates that are perceived as hawks. So they would like something that is more in the middle. And maybe this reflects the beliefs that who is there is going to tip the balance of the FOMC and the votes and the direction of policy that might be not in the same line as their preferences. And I conclude, so I don't want to repeat everything. I just want to say that if we are going to do this study, let's say going forward, maybe we are not going to see these differences for one reason that these schools, so I mentioned Chicago type of school and Keynesian types of school, these schools now, with the passing of time, they have given and taken a lot from each other. So maybe, let's say if we do this 20 years later, we'll not see such differences in the ideology. But one thing maybe to look further for the future is that a lot of central banks now, after the financial crisis, are looking at the financial stability as well as one of the objectives. So maybe now these hawks and doves has to be looked as well with respect to this objective that some central banks have taken more strongly in consideration. And how this plays out if you have conservatives, maybe pro-regulation, or liberals, let's say, less regulated, and one can think about hawks and doves in this, for this objective as well. And this is all. I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
One question. Could we see the graphs of the hawks and doves? Hawks and doves as red and...
Yes. You want to see that?
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I have here as well. So what should I explain here?
It's red is the hawks, yeah?
Yes.
Interest in the Kurt Walker period. The Kurt
This
Walker
one.
was
Yes.
fresh water. But he appointed by the Democrat period.
Yes.
It's some exclusion from this rule, right?
Yes.
Because it's mostly during the period he is hawks, because he struggled with
Hyperinflation,
yeah?
yes. Yeah, so this is the idea as well that not always, so Volcker he was a Democrat by beliefs. I could find on internet that he's
appointed during the Jimmy Carter.
Yes, and he was appointed by the Democratic president.
Democratic, yeah.
But then he was confirmed, I think 3 times, then Reagan, so another time by a Republican president. So for him, it doesn't match the politics, the appointment. And Volcker was already part of the FOMC since 1975. He was the president of New York Fed. So he was already part of the FOMC. And since 1975, he was believed to be, perceived to be a hawk. And in 1979, his type was really like established as a hawk. One, let's say, a curiosity or a bit like people raise eyebrows when they see that the FOMC is perceived hawkish during the Great Inflation and say, how can it be? We know Great Inflation happened, and you're telling me that these people have been hawks or perceived as hawks? And this is a bit strange when we know how history, we know ex post what happened. But in real time, they have been perceived as hawks. Burns was perceived as hawks. Once I spoke about this paper with one Federal Reserve member that was from a long time ago, and he said it's not possible. Burns was a villain. But in paper and in real time, Burns was really talking forcefully against inflation. And the FOMC that he was the people, they were talking forcefully against inflation. Now, Orphanides has a study when he does this Taylor type of rule, and is saying that if you take into account the data, the information that they had about output gap, they really behaved with how optimal central banker would behave today. So Orphanides is saying that the problem of FOMC in the 70s was mismeasurement of data. And there are some other type of papers who are saying it's about misconceptions about the state or how economy works. And what I find is that also those hawks that looked in real time were not all time hawks, were swingers as well. So as soon as the unemployment reached 7%, they would go back to slowing down with interest rates. Yes?
Can you show slide is the interest rates change?
Yes. Yes. Here.
As I understand, this is the dominance of DAS, yes?
Yes, exactly.
So, how do you think about the view that after dot-com crisis Fed was really slow in the interest rate hike, and partly it could contribute to global financial imbalances in global?
Yeah.
What do you think? Because you're...
Yeah, so this research as well is showing that while the state, so first of all, in the cutting of interest rates, so there was a recession here. This green, this is supposed to be gray. So this gray says that there was a recession in 2001, and Fed was reducing rates. However, the Fed went with the red, reducing rates more than the state of the economy. State of the economy with these dashed lines, the black here, it looks like black. So state of the economy was suggested to be here, Fed went here. So went much deeper than the state of the economy. And with the hawks and doves and this dovish majority, you can see that the blue line suggests that they would go much deeper than the state of the economy. And when we were going up, state of the economy suggests that they should go higher, so faster. But with the dovish majority, they were going slower than the state of the economy. So it kind of gives the impression that if you have the dovish majority, they might be faster to go down and slower to go up.
Thank you very much for excellent research, and that just for my curiosity, how long did it take for you to go through all these papers and collect this data set?
Yeah, so the collecting of making this hawk and dove characterization, I think if I put all, it has not been all in the same time. So it took me years and meeting. I got a job at the Banque de France. I worked on other papers, so I guess 6 months if I've just been reading, and I had an intern for 3 months to help me with reading of those papers as well. And going forward, I have to think of a strategy using this algorithm, like artificial intelligence, how to create, to teach an algorithm to do the things that I did, but I have to think more about that. So at the moment, I don't know, because as you saw, I'm really like going. FOMC members, I guess as well, the board members here, if somebody's talking about them, usually they are as a package. So there will be one article that mentioned 12 names, or here will be 7 or 5, I don't remember how much you have. And then the algorithm should be able to distinguish for whom they are talking. So in an article with 12 names, to find who's the dovish or the hawkish there. And sometimes they will say Fisher, Lacker, and I don't know, a name are more worried about inflation due to quantitative easing, while Yellen, Powell, and I don't know, another one are more worried about, let's say, growth and unemployment. So I have to find a way for the algorithm to distinguish for whom they are talking and for what. But it takes some time. So I was lucky that the bank gave me the time.
And may I ask you one more question? It's about the sample of your estimation.
Yes.
So it ends in, sorry, maybe I missed
So
it.
for the Taylor rule or?
For Taylor rule, yeah.
For Taylor rule, we stopped in 2007 for 2 reasons. One is that it really stops at the financial crisis. The idea is that when the financial crisis hit, Federal Reserve looked at other variables that relate to financial stability that might have been important to include in the Taylor rules. It's not the standard Taylor rule anymore. This is one. And second, then just 1 year later, interest rate was put at, reached the let's say, effective lower bound. So again, monetary policy is not done with federal fund rate or with a Taylor rule. So that's why we stopped in 2007.
Have you tried to assess the current contribution of the FOMC? So the current contribution.
I have stopped in 2015, so
Yeah.
I have to do the same. I have to continue with the categorization of the members, but
Yeah.
First I have to get
Okay.
to convince people about this, and then create a strategy, maybe with an algorithm or with research students, to keep doing this. First, the categorization of members, because now there are new members as well. So it needs time. It needs some work.
Okay, so once again, thank you very much for the excellent research. It was really very interesting. Again, especially trying to do some parallels with our case and try to assess who is the hawkish person, who the most hawkish person in our embassy, and who is the most dovish. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.